What's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel, and in this week's video I'll be going over how I made these bow ties for these charcuterie boards. So if you follow my channel, you saw that I made some charcuterie boards in a different video a couple weeks back. I had some leftover walnut and I needed to make a few more charcuterie boards. Unfortunately, what I had was cracked, but instead of getting rid of that, I decided to fix it with bow ties. So this video, I'll show you how I did it. So this is a fairly easy process. All you need is a bow tie template and this adapter with the router bit. Now, I'll put a link in the description to both of these products, but this adapter will go on the underside of the router and then the template will guide that to cut out a perfect bow tie. So this is the bottom guide on the router. This will pop in on the underside and then this will lock that on. So that's nice and tight. Now this bushing collet type thing here will slide around the bow tie template and it'll cut out the exact same shape, only slightly inward of the bow tie. So if we hold this up here, this will set right down in there and then it'll cut along the outside of the guide and it'll cut out a perfect shape. After we have the outline cut out, we put this other bushing over top of this. And then it slides even further on the inside of the template, and then we can go in the middle and this will be used to cut out the inside shape of the bow tie. Here's the router bit. This is either a spiral upcut or a down cut that came with the bit, and that will go right through the center of this. And as we plunge down, this is the part that'll make the cut in the template. So to try to get a visual on this, I'll put this on a piece of wood and I'll try to do it with a pin. So this is the bow tie that we'll be cutting. This will be in the router with a bit going through this. Instead, I'll use a pin to trace the outline. So this first cut without the bushing will be the outline. And this would be if we were cutting the bow ties out. So that's a little sloppy, but instead of a line, this would be a cut the width of the bow tie. So we would have a solid piece in the middle with a groove cut all the way out around this. So if this board was a lot thinner, it would go all the way through, or we could resaw this piece in half. The bow tie should actually be going the other way because of the grain. But as an example, we would resaw this out and then the bow tie would fall out on the cut lines and we would have a solid piece in the center. If we pop this piece back on, then we can cut the same bow tie over here. And you can see how this one is a little smaller. So on this one, with the collar on, after we make that first cut on the outside, we would actually go back and then cut out all of the center of this too. So everything in here would also be cut out and we would be left with a hole. Now, because of the way these are lined up with the size of each, whatever is cut from this piece will fit exactly in here, minus maybe sanding the corners out a little bit. So I'll show you what that'll look like. All you need are these pieces and a router and you're good to go. This is really easy once you've done it a couple times. So first I wanted to cut the actual inlays, the bow ties that would go into the hole that I cut out. I had this scrap 3/4 inch walnut, so that's what I'm using here. You can use a different type of wood, and a lot of people will use maple as it contrasts with the dark walnut well, but the sapwood on the outside, which is the lighter color of this walnut, works just fine for me. So I clamped the template down. Now you're supposed to use double-sided tape, but I found that clamps work better and I don't have any double-sided tape. So I clamped it on place on the edge of the piece that I'm using, and then I used the router to cut the outside groove, which will give us the main shape of that inlay. Right now the adapter on the bottom of the router does not have the extra bushing on it, so it's closer to the outside of the template than when we have the other piece on as well. Here's a closer look at the first one that I've cut. So whenever we resaw this board down the middle, these pieces will just essentially fall out. So the crack on the boards that I had was pretty big, so I wanted to cut several of these out. Now you can use any of the template holes that you want and make them different sizes. I just decided to keep them all the same size because I kind of thought that it would look better that way. Here's another look up close at what the bow ties look like as they're cut on the template. And then after that, I just continued to go right down the full length of the board, cutting out as many of these as I could. Now, since the board was a little bit thicker than the depth that I was plunging, I was able to cut these on both sides. So I got 16 out of these all together. Here's a look at the full board on one side and then the other side. There's still quite a bit of board left if I were to rip this in half and then use what was left over, but this was enough for what I needed. Now I have this set of spacer blocks to make accurate measurements whenever you're really trying to make something precise. So this was the perfect opportunity to see how far exactly the bit was plunging. It was just over 1/4 of an inch, so I put this on the table saw and then moved the fence to 1/4 of an inch, which in theory should give me the same measurement as the depth that I plunged. After the depth was set, I then raised the blade up to where the height of the blade would be equal to the top of the cutouts. You can go higher, it doesn't really matter, just as long as you are as high as the cutouts go, and then the board can be resawn down the middle. You could also do this with a bandsaw that might work a little bit better. This worked fine on the table saw. If you do this, be sure to be careful and go slow and do not rush this cut. So I flipped the board around and then I cut it on the other side, and then the bow ties should be able to be broken off and taken out. I did rip the other end of the board off just to save that piece of walnut, and then it would be easier for me to break these out. Here's what I was left with, and then I was able to simply break these apart and break all the edges off, leaving just the bow tie. Now I know earlier I measured using the spacer block to 1/4 of an inch, so it should have been exactly the same. I actually backed the fence off just a little bit because I would much rather have these pieces too thick and just sand them down rather than have them too thin and not be at least flush whenever I put them into the board on the slot that I'll cut out here in a minute. Here's what I was left with, which was a big batch of walnut bow ties. And then with those completed, it was time to cut out the slot that goes in the board. So here's the crack that I was talking about earlier. As you can see, it's a pretty big crack. It goes all the way through on both sides. So without putting these inlays in, this board might crack further and the piece would be ruined. So at this point, we want to pop the bearing onto the adapter in the bottom of the router. Now this will push the spiral bit a little bit further in, like you can see here, and then those inlays that we cut out will fit right down in there almost perfectly. So I placed the template on the board with the center of the bow tie right in the middle of the crack. And then at this point, all we have to do is cut out this section completely. So here, usually I'll first go around the outside and make the first pass. And then what's left in the center, which is the two pieces that I'm touching here, will also need cut out. So you can put the router back on and just randomly try to cut out what you can. Whatever you don't get, you'll be able to cut out with a chisel, which I actually prefer. It's a little bit easier. The router bit works just fine, and there's nothing wrong with using that. It just sometimes kind of takes the path that's already cut out, so it's a little bit difficult to cut every single piece out. So I wanted 3 bow ties on each side of this charcuterie board, so I just moved the template up and then did the same process in the center of the board, and then I'll do one up at the top piece as well, all the way along the length of the crack. Now one thing that's important here, and whenever you're cutting any of these pieces out, is to make sure that you have the template either clamped down or somehow secured in a spot that it won't shift at all. Especially when you're picking the router up to sweep out the excess or to cut it out with a chisel. If you bump the template and it shifts at all one way or the other, that will throw off the dovetail. And whenever you go back to finish the cut, since the template is moved, it won't line up and you'll be off on the dovetail, and that will ruin that spot. Here's a closer look at the 3 slots I cut out, so you can see that the center of those is right on the middle of the crack, and this will hopefully help the board from cracking any further, as it won't be able to pull apart because of the shape of the bow tie. So whenever you cut the inlays out, the bow ties will end up with sharp corners, and these will need sanded down in order for them to fit in the slots. So you can do this very easily with just a scrap piece of sandpaper. It takes a couple seconds to go over each corner, which helps round them over, and then they'll fit right down exactly in the slots that you cut previously. Since the corners are small, this doesn't take very long at all. You can get through a set of these in only a couple minutes. With the corners sanded out and smoothed up, it was time to dry fit these into the slots. So usually first I'll make sure that they do fit. You don't want to pound them in with the hammer yet because you want to put glue in there, and if you do put them in, you obviously can't get them back out. So once they seem like that they fit pretty well, I put a little bit of glue in each of the slots, and then I just use a Q-tip, or you could use whatever you have to help smear the glue around a little bit. You don't need a ton of glue because there's nowhere for the glue to go after you put these in. And then after you do have them in place, you can tap them all the way in with a hammer. So as I mentioned earlier, I like to keep these a little bit thicker, that way that they protrude out just a little bit, which can be sanded down thereafter. So normally I'll do this on both sides to prevent the board not only from cracking but from cupping on one side of the other. And then after they're hammered in, I clamp the board down and I will just sand them down. So I start out with 80 grit and work my way up to 220. On these boards I did raise the grain by putting water on the surface and then sanding it out a couple times, which should help keep the board smooth and nicely finished after it's used and after it's washed a couple times. Once you get these sanded flush, they turn out really smooth and you can run your hand over it and you really can't even tell that there's a different type of surface there. So as I mentioned, this is a pretty easy process after you've done it a couple of times, and the bow ties usually turn out great. Now here's some bonus footage of how I finished these after they were done. So I'll first oil soak the boards, and this is Walrus Oil brand cutting board oil. It's a natural product. I think there's only 3 or 4 ingredients, but it's food safe, completely safe to touch. Now I'm just wearing a glove because it's easier to wear a glove and throw it away than try to wash this off of my hands. But this is perfectly safe for skin contact, for food contact. And this gives an awesome finish to the walnut, especially with the grain, and really brings these boards to life. And also, unlike staining or finishing something, you really can't mess this process up, as all you're doing is rubbing oil into the board. I'll usually let the board set for a day or so and then go back over with this wood wax. So this is also Walrus Oil brand, and this product is awesome. I also like how it gives a nice sheen to the board overall and really gives it that finished look. So if you are making a set of these, whether they be with or without bow ties, I'd really recommend checking out the Walrus Oil products, as they work great for charcuterie boards and for cutting boards as well. So if you're interested in either of those products, or the template or the router or any other products in this video, I will leave a link to those in the description. I'll also post a link to the other charcuterie board video. So thank you for watching, and as always, stay tuned for more.